Welcome to another IG Live with Clean Health. I am the accredited practicing dietitian from Clean Health Astrid, and I have the pleasure to speak today with Stefan ENF. And today our topic is about programming, about utilizing somatotypes. So this is going to be a very interesting topic for us to talk about. And I think before getting started, make sure you check all PNC, our Performance Nutrition Coaching Level 1 that is being revised, and our Level 2 as well. And I think you can't miss this Black Friday offer. So just make sure you jump onto that offer, 70% off. And without anything else to say about that, let's get Stefan on.
I think this is going to be very interesting. So I'm very excited to talk about this. So much information that we can share today.
Hey, Astrid.
Hi, Stefan. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm very excited to have you on. How are you?
Good. Can you hear me well? Because I'm not using earphones today. I'm just charging my phone.
Yes. No, that's fine. I think that it's fine. You can hear me well?
I can hear you. I can hear you fine.
Perfect. So our topic today is about talking about somatotypes and how could these influence our programming in nutrition in terms of macronutrients, calories. I guess what I really wanted to talk about before getting into the actual topic is understanding or talking about what does the term body type or somatotype mean?
1 second. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, that's better. Way better. Okay. So, look, the somatotypes are a broad generalization of a person's body, the characteristics of a person's body type. So, for example, there's 3 primary types. We have ectomorph, mesomorph, endomorph. So, ectomorph is generally someone with smaller bone structure. They tend to be more long and rectangular. They tend to generally carry less muscle mass. They tend to have less body fat because they carry less body fat cells. So they tend to be long and thin generally. We have endomorph, who tends to be more rounded. So thicker joints, higher amount of body fat, tend to have a more rounded structure. And then mesomorph is someone who is just, again, thicker joint structure, more muscular, broader shoulders, puts on muscle easy, not a lot of body fat, so not like an endomorph who's prone to putting on body fat. And these are just broad categorizations. The thing is, if you got to look at the whole thing on a spectrum, like pure types are very rare. Like in physiology, everything exists along a continuum, right? So 70% of people are going to fall in the middle of the spectrum. You're going to have a small percentage of outliers, 50 about. Because, so you have in anything in physiology, about 68% of people, or 70% to be, I guess, a bit more vague, fall within one standard deviation of the mean, right? So you're going to have about 15, 16% outliers at one extreme. You're going to have 15, 16% outliers at the other extreme. So in terms of the body types, most people will be a combination of 3. They'll have some characteristics of mesomorph, some characteristics of ecto, some characteristics of endo. You're going to get about 15% of population which are pure ectomorphs, and these people are very easy to distinguish. They're the people that very hard for them to put on body fat. They naturally stay thin. They naturally tend to have a lower appetite. And then you have the people that are pure endomorphs, so they're going to be more on that end of the spectrum, which are people that are naturally bigger. They tend to be naturally heavier. They tend to have a much harder time losing weight. So that's kind of 3 types, and you're going to have everyone else sort of fall in the middle of the spectrum.
Okay, so in regards to that somatotype, where did the concept of somatotype came about, and how does this apply to defining nutrition, even if we're not talking about specifically athletes? Because what I understand is that somatotypes was a topic and was a term that wasn't utilized in athletes to categorize about looking at who would perform better at certain sports, see what the length of some of their limbs were. And now that has been moved into nutrition to see whether some people, for people's body fat distribution would go about, well, this person is more muscular than this one that has more fat. So then this should be applied in the same spectrum, the same form. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think, look, for training definitely has some relevance. So, for example, if you're a thinner ectomorph body type, you're naturally going to, because of the thinner joints, your body's not going to tolerate the heavy loads as well as someone with a thicker joint structure. So, for example, if you look at when my mom, she spoke to the Bulgarian weightlifting coach, Ivana Bajiev, back when like they were, winning all the medals in the late 90s, early 2000s. So he was the head coach at that time. He said the number one predictor of an athlete's success in weightlifting is how thick their joints are, for them to withstand the rigors of the type of training they did. So an ectomorph is generally not going to be very well suited to lifting heavy weights because it'll take a pounding on their joints. An ectomorph by nature as well tends to over-secrete stress hormones. Okay, they tend to be high catechol, what we call high catechol phenotype. So because they have a higher baseline catechol activity, they tend to have high cortisol, high dopamine, high norepinephrine. They tend to, if you give them too much volume as well, they tend to drop into a catabolic state quicker. Okay, so the type of that's why typically the ectomorphs is the ones we call the hard gainers. The ones that have a harder time putting on muscle, and a lot of that has to do with that highest amount of stress hormones they secrete. So because of that, they're not going to be able to withstand those marathon training sessions like, say, an endo or a mesomorph can. They tend to have a more favorable hormone profile, and also their body, their joints tend to be able to withstand the rigors of that type of training a little bit better. So, and as well as that, if we look at lever lengths, as you said, that has an implication for the type of exercises you select. So, for example, we know athletes with longer levers tend to have a greater what's called bilateral deficit. So what that means is the bilateral deficit is basically when we look at the sum of each limb independently, it adds up more than when the two limbs work together. So take, for example, a leg extension. If you can normally do with two legs 100 pounds on the leg extension for, say, 12 reps, if you took each leg independently, you'd probably do 60, 65 pounds. So if we take 60 plus 60, that equals 120. So the sum of both limbs acting independently, it adds up to greater than when the two limbs work together. And it's been shown athletes that have longer limbs tend to have a greater bilateral deficit. So they would benefit more from unilateral exercises as opposed to bilateral exercises. So more split squats, more one-arm dumbbell rows, things of that nature versus the big basics like more of an endo or an mesomorph would perform well on. So definitely some relevance as far as training with your natural structure and body type. Now, this concept has to a degree been carried over to nutrition as well. And in recent years, it's received a lot of criticism, from people in the evidence-based community saying there's absolutely no scientific backing. We've ourselves copped quite a bit of criticism from people asking why, we've in the past promoted using, somatotypes to try to individualize nutrition programs. Even, we the guide we put out recently, the Fat Loss Fundamentals, we had a little bit about it in the guide. And as soon as we put that up, we had people writing in, questioning about it. And it's we actually decided to take it out because if you don't really provide the right context around it, people can misinterpret the way in which this could be used to help with, designing nutrition plans. So I do think it does have relevance to a person's nutrition plan. It's not like, the end or be all of things, but to me, it's more indicative, okay? So it's indicative of what someone's more predisposed or certain type of nutrition plan someone may or may not be predisposed to. Because one of the things that seems to influence the type of nutrition plan a person responds to is how efficient their metabolism is, so metabolic efficiency. So if we look at, and there's quite a bit of research on this. If you want to look at, splenthrift versus thrifty metabolic types, there's evidence, looking at the efficiency of a person's metabolism. So there's evidence that shows some people naturally have more inefficient metabolisms. What that means is when they consume food, they extract less of the ATP from the food, and more the calories they consume actually go towards making heat. That's what an inefficient metabolism is. And there's certain people that have higher expression of genes involved in energy expenditure and a lower expression of genes involved in conserving energy. There's evidence to suggest that. And it seems to be related to the efficiency of the mitochondria. So how efficiently do the mitochondria extract ATP from the food that we eat? So what a lot of people don't actually know is mitochondria, they have two functions. So the first function we know is to create energy, to produce ATP from the food that we eat. But the second function for the mitochondria is actually to create heat. And depending on, if you have efficient mitochondria, you make, for every calorie you consume, you extract more ATP. If you have an inefficient mitochondria, for every calorie you consume, you extract less ATP and you produce more heat. So you could eat, two people can eat the same amount of calories. One person can store more of those calories, whereas the other person can more inefficiently burn them. So for example, if we look at the overfeeding literature, some people will overfeed and they will gain weight, whereas other people tend to overfeed and they tend to resist weight gain. Okay, they tend to be more resistant to weight gain because there's an increase in heat dissipation, and there's also an increase in non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So there's that inefficiency in mitochondria. So these people, they extract less heat. They tend to naturally have, some people naturally tend to have higher spontaneous activity than other people. But also, for the same amount of movement, for a given amount of movement, you could have two people, both people walk from A to B, and the person who's efficient will use less energy to perform that amount of physical activity. The person who's less efficient, they'll walk from A to B and they'll burn more energy than the next person. So not only so they dissipate more their energy as heat because they don't efficiently use the calories. So that's what we call an inefficient metabolic type. Whereas an efficient metabolic type, what we call a thrifty metabolic type, they tend to conserve energy really well. And if we look at people's responses, for example, for over and under feeding, like we said, certain people, you overfeed them, their energy thermogenesis, their heat dissipation goes up, they tend to resist weight gain. Other people, you overfeed them, they don't get that same increase in heat dissipation or activity thermogenesis, so they end up putting on more weight. Same thing when we reduce calories. When we reduce caloric intake, some people, the metabolism adapts downwards really rapidly to compensate for the reduced food intake and in order to conserve energy. Other people, they don't get that same response. Their metabolism remains fairly stable and they're able to continue losing weight because they don't have that same decline in metabolic rate because they don't have, their metabolism is not as efficient, so to speak. So metabolic efficiency, and this is the other thing to look at as well, is if we look at the refeeding literature, there's some people that respond favorably to refeeding and others that don't. And again, that could have to do with how efficient your metabolism is and whether you're storing those excess calories or whether you're not, and how well the body handles them. So metabolic efficiency is probably one of the key things that determines how a person responds to a certain diet. So how aggressively we can increase their calories versus how aggressive we can decrease their calories. Are they going to be responsive to refeeding or not responsive to refeeding? How fast they lose weight, things of that nature. So that is largely determined by a person's metabolic efficiency. Now, one of the best sort of indicators that we have of a person's metabolic efficiency is their body type, okay? Because, like I said, there's a handful, the pure ectomorphs in the room, because they're the people that, they don't gain weight. Those people that, they eat a lot of crap, but they tend to resist weight gain. So there's a small percentage of the people that are lucky like that in that they're very inefficient, they tend to resist weight gain. There's other people that look at a piece of cake and they put weight on, okay? So the body type is kind of, again, it's an indication of how efficient someone's metabolism. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily, though, you can't have someone that's, was relatively thin or normal and they became overweight. So yes, here's the criticism against using body types to, I guess, make nutritional recommendations is that it's not static, that they can change, right? And you could have someone that was an ectomorph, supposedly, or normal, and then, that when they were young, and then they stopped exercising, they started eating a lot of crap, and as they got older, they gained weight, and, they became an endomorph. That's the argument against it. And look, no doubt that can happen, but you got to look at, this is why you have to take everything in context, and you got to look at the person's, where did they start at? When they were younger, were they thin and then they gain weight? or were they overweight their whole life? You know what I mean? That'll give an indication. And naturally, do they lean more towards endomorph, or is there lifestyle choices that have somewhat led them to that point in them gaining weight? And remember, most people are kind of in the middle. So that means they can shift based on the lifestyle intervention. The pure types, as we said, are very rare, because it's very rare a pure ectomorph will gain weight, even with a shitty lifestyle. The pure ectomorph, A, they're so inefficient in how they use their calories, but B, because of their baseline high catechol activity, they tend to naturally have very low appetite. They tend to eat like rabbits to begin with. So true ectomorphs generally don't put on weight. If someone was thin and then they gained weight in their later years, they probably weren't a true ectomorph. You know what I mean? They'll probably, and even when the true ectomorphs gain weight, you can see they tend to gain it more around the belly, tend to still remain fairly thin around the extremities. So just like you can tell an ectomorph who's put on body fat versus someone who's naturally more mesomorphic, endomorphic, and thicker, you can even tell an ectomorph when they put on muscle versus someone who's naturally more mesomorphic or thicker. Because when an ectomorph puts on muscle, they still tend to maintain that thinner bone structure, and they tend to have, like, you know, the smaller bones, and then the bigger muscle belly tapers to the thinner joint, which actually looks quite aesthetically pleasing. But it's different in an meso, for example, or endo, who's naturally thicker and rounder. And, you know, they tend to have lower insertion points and so forth. So, yes, there is obviously a genetic component to it, and there is a lifestyle component to it as well. But even so, what we have to factor in is, as you gain body weight, your physiology changes. Okay, body fat, for example, high body fat is linked with leptin resistance, it's linked with insulin resistance, and it's linked with inflammation. So even if you were thinner or normal weight and you gained weight in your later years and you became more of like mixed type or ecto and you became more of an endo, your physiology at that point has changed. And there's a good amount of research to show that, you know, those with insulin resistance tend to generally do better on a lower carbohydrate diet. Okay, now insulin is another one of those things that in the last few years has kind of gotten a bad rep, like, you know, the insulin boogeyman is going to come get you, and like insulin now really doesn't matter. It's all about calories now. But, you know, that's kind of an oversimplistic view of things, because insulin is still important from the standpoint of managing your blood sugar levels. If someone can't manage their blood sugar levels effectively, they're going to have a hard time sticking to their diet. And what they've shown in particular, if someone has insulin resistance, they have insulin resistance to the brain. Now, insulin is naturally a satiety hormone. So when you have an increase in insulin, that satiates you if you have normal insulin function, and then you don't feel like eating again because your brain gets that satiety signal. When you have someone that's insulin resistant and they have insulin resistance to the brain, they eat carbs, but they don't get that satiety signal. So they keep overeating. And there's some research to show that someone with insulin resistance is 50 to 75%, or is likely to eat 50 to 75% more after a medium or a high GI meal compared to a low GI meal. So it's not so much the insulin itself that's going to make them fat, but it's that insulin that, because they're not getting the satiety signal, which then leads to overeating, that's what may cause them to gain weight, is that overeating, because they're not managing their blood sugar, they're not managing their satiety and their appetite. So then they end up going and not being able to stick to their plan, and then that overeating adversely affects them.
Yeah, and I guess just coming to what you were saying, the part of looking at, I think the backlash coming the somatotype, it has been that there have been quite a few personalities or influencers that sort of tell you have to be or do this if you have this body type, like categorizing that this person hasn't got any other room or are completely doomed if they are endomorph, or if you're mesomorph, you have certain qualities, but if you're endomorph, you're pretty much resigned to change whatever you are at that point. So as you say, it's more like a continuum, and you have to see the context of it to see that it's not that it's just static, but it's actually, you can transform on, like if you just do change your lifestyle, change your life.
Can you hear me? Sorry, you cut out for a sec.
I think that does that make sense? I think that's where the backlash has come around.
Well, yeah, there's no doubt you can, with certain lifestyle, change your body type. Anyone can gain fat, anyone can lose weight, but that's just the fact. You can just look at two people and you know they're not going to have the same response to a training program, just like they're not going to have the same response to a diet program. Now, it's generally, for, like I said, most people fall in the protein diet, just the isocaloric mixed type diet. So that's why majority of people, that's where I have them. If someone really is a pure ectomorph, as we said, they generally tend to be high catechol phenotypes. I like to give them higher carbs, because what carbs does is suppresses cortisol, it suppresses norepinephrine, so it actually levels them out and stabilizes them. And the pure ectos actually tend to feel better on a higher carb diet or a moderate to high carb diet, especially post-training when their catechol levels are jacked up even further. Give them a high carb like insulin spike. In these population, it helps bring down their cortisol levels. It helps get them out of that catabolic state faster. So look, if you look at the literature on, for example, intra-workout carbohydrate, most of the research don't show a benefit, right, in resistance training. But there is some research that does show a benefit. So that what that tells you is, for some people, it works. Just like if you look at most of the research, it doesn't seem to suggest the macronutrient ratio plays much of a role in fat loss, provided you control caloric intake. Most of the research, and that's again because most people tend to be mixed types. But there is some research that indicates otherwise. For example, there's one paper I can think of that looked at took a group of insulin-sensitive women and then took a group of insulin-resistant women, and they separated them into a high-carb, low-fat diet. Half went on a low-carb, high-fat diet, and then the insulin-sensitive women did the same thing. So they were again split into two groups. And here's what was interesting about that study is they controlled energy intake, and the insulin-sensitive women lost twice as much, almost twice as much fat for the same energy deficit on the higher carb, low-fat plan. Whereas the insulin-resistant women lost almost twice as much fat on the lower carb plan. Okay, even though they had the same deficit. And then the researchers identified in that particular study, there was a gene, it was called FOXC2 gene. And that gene was upregulated in certain people with a higher fat diet, and other people was upregulated with a higher carb, lower fat diet. So there is some, and like I said, there's also, if you look at research on people with insulin resistance and diabetes, pre-diabetes, there's some research to suggest they will have a better appetite management and also more favorable weight loss, especially weight around the visceral fat, that pro-inflammatory fat. Those people have more favorable weight loss on a lower carb diet. So that's why generally most people, I will recommend a mixed type of diet, which is again, that applies, which is what most influencers will tell you, that the macro split doesn't matter. It's all about the calories, which is probably true about 70% of the time, but we got to factor in the outliers as well. Like I said, there's a small percentage of people that are naturally more ectos. They generally do better on, they can handle the higher calories, they can handle the higher carbs quite well. They feel, more stable on the higher carbs. And then there's people that are very overweight, very insulin resistant, a lot of inflammation, very leptin resistant, that may do well initially, at least on a lower carb diet, because there was another study that showed low carb diets outperformed higher carb diets in 4 out of 5 markers of metabolic syndrome. So someone that has metabolic syndrome. So maybe, but that was in the first 3 months. And then after that, it sort of balanced out. So maybe in the first 3 months, they'll do better on a low carb diet. And then as they start leaning out and improve some of those markers, they can then transition to more of a mixed diet. But that was without training. So you see, training changes things a little bit because training improves insulin sensitivity. But even so, this is a guideline. People should not be so dogmatic about it and take it like it's gospel and it has to be like that. At the end of the day, the diet the person can stick to, that's probably the diet. Even if it works slower initially, if they can stick to it, if they enjoy it, that's probably going to be the best diet for them, you know. So we simply use the somatotypes as a guide, because most people, like especially Gen Pop clients, when they come to see a coach, they have no idea what works best for them. They don't know what fuel mix they feel best on. You know, they've been eating like absolute crap for the last how many years. So it's about kind of, so we're not shooting in the dark, kind of establishing some starting point for the person, trialing them, looking at their biofeedback markers, seeing how they feel, and then making adjustments. So it's not so black and white. It's not so dogmatic, end all be all kind of thing like people think we're making it out to be. So I think it's important when you talk about this to present it in the right context, you know, and we do that in the PNC. So if you're interested in actually seeing, because, you know, one of the things that really astounds me is when people say there's no research behind this or somatotypes. Well, there's no direct research where they said low carb diet was shown to affect, you know, and better for endomorph body type. But for people that are more overweight, for example, yes, there's evidence to show that. For people that are more insulin resistant, yes, there's evidence to show that. There's evidence to show that there's thrifty metabolic types and spendthrift metabolic types. So the evidence is there, and we present that in the PNC. PNC2 especially, we do a thorough review of all the research in that area. We recently just redid or updated the PNC1, and now I've put a section in there specifically for that to give at least some rundown, because we talk about, you know, using the body types there as a guide to sort of as a starting point when you're allocating someone's macros. So we wanted to, again, provide a little bit more context around it so people can see kind of where we're coming from with this thing.
I like that idea. I like that because you would get more, like if you use that as a more like as a starting point and more like an indicative, a descriptive idea of, well, maybe because I don't have much information about this client, I can just use this sort of how this person looks to sort of perhaps have a potential idea where this person could be coming from in terms of their metabolic health. Absolutely. Or where there's some potential insulin resistance. And then you might be able to assess in depth when you're sort of looking at the whole lifestyle, their eating habits, and you're more able to target a better nutrition and a better exercise for that particular person. And I guess that is the context that you want to see the more you work with the client, and using that biofeedback as a indicative of, well, this person is necessarily going to be much better by responding with this nutritional approach. Maybe they are better by going lower carbohydrates because they don't respond well because of their insulin resistance. And you want to always have this context. But I like that you're saying that it's not necessarily that is you have to be so dogmatic about it, or that that's a problem, it is like and that's a very problem that we see all the time, that people think that if you're targeting or saying something that has been already categorized as a myth or something that you might be going to the wrong pathway, that, oh no, you're not evidence-based because this is completely have been debunked over the years. And
the thing is, it hasn't. So I have yet anyone whose makes that claim to show me a paper that has been, debunked. I mean, what they're typically referring to is that most studies seem to show that as long as you control for calories, the macronutrient ratio doesn't matter that much. Yeah. But as I said, if we start going towards populations with more insulin resistance and more overweight population, again, some of the studies, yes, seem to show that. Not all of them, but you got to factor in even two people at the exact same body fat can have a 10-fold difference in how they respond to insulin. Yeah. So body fat is just one of the factors. So you got to look, it's multifactorial thing. You got to look at all the factors. That's why when we take on a client, we go through a thorough history of that client, consider everything, what they're currently eating, what they've tried in the past, have they gained weight, have they lost weight? Like, you got to take the client's whole history into account, make an educated decision based on what you think will work for that client, see how the client responds to it. And then again, if like if you've got an endo and you've put them on a low carb diet, I mean, I can tell you from experience, we've like in Clean Health over the last, 12 or so years, we've trained like thousands, probably in the vicinity, just between myself and some of the coaches, 20,000 plus clients. We have a huge database of clients that we work with to know quite well that most overweight clients, you put them on a low carb diet, and which is also easy to comply for them because it takes tracking too many macros out of the, it makes it easier for them, and they tend to drop weight really quickly, more often than not. But if you get a client, real overweight client who you assume is very insulin resistant, you put them on a low carb diet and they feel like shit, that doesn't mean you keep them on a low carb diet because all their somatotypes said they have to be on a low carb diet. That's the thing. You know what I mean? I think a lot of time the people that are backlashing against this are doing it in a way to show how smart they are and how much they know, and like, oh, this isn't really proven, and let's discard it altogether now. It's not a perfect science, but there's still some value, in using it to guide you.
And I guess it can be much useful for someone who hasn't got the skills or the complete access to the person's medical health history or something like that, where you might not know the entire history of the person until you actually speak with the client. And some personal trainers and some people that are working with some clients, they haven't got all that skill set that are necessarily aware of all these potential issues behind someone's metabolic health. So perhaps utilizing this as a gauge, but also understanding that this is something to not be just very dogmatic about it, but more as a starting point. It is the most important thing. It's not just to think that is the all be all concept that you have to be putting people into boxes or like naming, well, you're completely endomorph, you're completely fucked, you're not potentially able to lose fat efficiently, or maybe you're not able to transition to be potentially one day more muscular or more endomorph. So I think what people use a lot is that there are certain people that have been able to transition from one extreme to another, and that's where a lot of people come back against these somatotypes.
Well, I know what you're talking about. Like, I'll take my father, for example. He is a type 2. Like, when he was in his younger days, it was quite thin. It's probably bordering more towards ecto. And then as he got older, eating a lot of crap. I mean, he got away with it in his younger days, but as he got older and moved less and just ate more and more shit, he gained weight, especially around that belly. Now, he then developed type 2 diabetes because of poor lifestyle. So it's not to say that you can't. He got away with it for a while, probably a lot longer than most other people would have, but he still developed it. Now, having said that, when we put him on then a carb-restricted eating regimen, his blood sugar levels improved alarmingly that the GP had to pull him off his meds because it showed improvement. So look, his physiology changed. So what he's going to need at that point in time may not be the same as another point in time. So yes, it's not a static marker. It changes over time, and there's both a genetic component to it, which predisposes you to be more of one or another. And then there's a lifestyle component to it as well. But even if through lifestyle, your physiology's changed over the years, then your nutrition approach may temporarily need to change, to bring yourself out of inflammation and insulin resistance. And then it shifts back. As the pendulum swings back to balance, you shift more back to balance. Doesn't have to be so rigid. Yeah.
And I think one important point is to perhaps be more emphatic about the protein and energy ratio. In most of the clients, you want to make sure you're increasing the protein intake to a point where they are able to have at least 30% of the calories coming from protein, and managing their carbohydrates and fats according to how they respond better to. So correct. I think that's a lot of people don't pay attention too much on the protein side of it.
On that same note too, I've had clients that more leaning towards that endomesomorphic profile naturally, and you can see because of the thick joints, like in the ankles and knees, and usually strong guys, and they got lean on a low carb diet, and then when as they got lean and we tried to transition them back to more higher carb diet, they just felt horrible on it. They ended up being non-compliant with their plan and just putting on a ton of weight back on. So we had to scale them back to maintain a relatively more low-carb lifestyle, because they're now naturally more towards that endomorphic end of the spectrum. So that's two examples right there. You could have someone who's naturally, like my dad, as we said, who was naturally more towards ecto, but then as he got older, metabolism slowed, stopped exercising, ate crap, gained a lot of weight. He became more an endo at that point in time. But as, improved his eating and dropped weight, he's more normalized. Whereas someone who's naturally more leaning towards that endo and naturally was always a little bit more overweight and struggled with their weight, you might use a low-carb diet to get them lean. And then even once they get lean, they might be able to, because their carbohydrate tolerance improves, they might be able to handle a bit more carbs, but still naturally just do better on a little bit less. That's a possibility. And that's why it's not static. You have to look at the person's biofeedback. You have to see how they're responding, and you have to go with what's sustainable for that person. That's still, that triumphs everything else, at the end of the day.
I like that. And I think that's the most important thing, that we were able to provide more context. I think we can use this video to sort of, just take that video back, because there's much more information, much more context than just looking at, obviously in our courses, we can't have or dedicate very long time to explain all of this, because it has a lot of nuance.
We do put a little bit of time into this to look at metabolic efficiency, especially, and some of the factors that contribute. Like we talked about the mitochondria being the dominant factor. There's also research now showing that the gut microbiome plays a role. So some people have naturally more efficient microbiota, so they extract more ATP from the food. Other people have less efficient. And again, they extract less ATP from the food. And they've done studies, you're probably aware, in mice where they take gut bacteria from an overweight mouse, they inject it into a lean mouse, and even without dietary changes, that lean mouse gains weight, becomes overweight. And then they take the bacteria from another lean mouse, inject it back into that same lean mouse, and again, with no changes to their diet or lifestyle, they lose weight again. So there's 100% is a genetic component to it that predisposes people to be a certain type. We can't overlook that, So we're talking about microbiota. It's the gut microbiome. It's the bacteria within your gut. So there's a lot of research now in that field of how the gut microbiome affects, things like your brain chemistry, inflammation levels in the body, the ability to lose weight, the, immune system, a whole bunch of things. It's a new area of research that's really up and coming, very exciting.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I think this has been great. This has been a great and very informative live. I don't think anyone would be thinking differently. So thank you so much, Stefan, for joining us and being here to provide more information and more context about this topic.
I hope that clears things up a little bit. And when people start questioning us about that, it's not like we're not aware that there's other authorities in the industry criticizing this whole use of somatotypes. But I think it's really about, like you said, there's other influences that are making it like so rigid and dogmatic, when it's in reality, it's neither. You shouldn't discard it completely, and you shouldn't be that completely dogmatic about it where it rules everything that you do. It's in an indicator that you're using initially to get you started on the right path, and then you're seeing how your client adapts, and then getting more information as time goes.
That's perfect. I agree. So with that being said, I think this is all the questions we have got for today. Yeah. So if you want to learn more about these guys, just check all the courses we have in PNC. We've got 2 levels, a new version of level 1. Level 2 is just being launched. So a lot of good stuff in there. In the Black Friday, we've got an amazing, huge sale. So make sure you don't miss this opportunity. Do you want to say anything else, Stefan?
No, I think you kind of wrapped it up really well. If you want to learn more about this and see that there is a lot of evidence behind what we're saying, definitely check out PNC 1. PNC 2, we go even in a lot more detail. PNC 2 is very in-depth. Basically, there's about 100 plus references in each of the modules. I think in total there's over 600 references for the entire course. So not only do we have a database of thousands of clients that we've trained over the years that we can, that take that practical and in the trenches experience, but we're also very well read in research. We're up to date with the latest research up until, 219, 220. And another thing that we talk about in the PNC, that it's still an up and coming area that you don't really hear much people talk about, but it's chrononutrition. So there's now some evidence showing that, certain people can have the same amount of calories, and depending on what time of the day they have those calories, they can lose more weight, even at the exact same calories, because it's more favorable to their circadian rhythm. So there is some emerging, especially over the last 2 years, there's definitely some research that's come out that's shown. So we do try to stay really ahead of the curve and look at some of these things that they're not often talked about. I mean, right, these days it's become very popular to just, make it all about calories, don't worry about anything else. And yes, that's the most important thing, but that should be a given pretty much. That shouldn't even be spoken about. But there's other things that too, can make a difference. And especially when we start looking at things like, mobilizing stubborn fat, and the physiology of someone with stubborn fat changes, then we have to look at some of those more acute things that people often overlook, like fat oxidation and insulin and all those things. So we break all that down quite well in the PNC. We present all the literature, and like I said, we use case studies of different clients we've worked with to demonstrate these systems. So, Black Friday sales up to 70% off. So I would jump on that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Stefan. I hope to see you next week. And
no worries.
You have a great day.
See you guys. Bye.